for context, let's just read from 2 lines from the bottom of Zion and Bet. We had just read the Mishnah of Rabbi Beit Hillel and Beit Shammai about what can you take to the mikvah on Shabbos, or Shabbos or Yontiv, where everybody agrees you can't immerse vessels, kalim, but there's a debate whether a person can immerse. So the Gemara says, the Chulei Alma, 2 lines from the bottom on Zion and Bet, the Chulei Alma Mias, everybody agrees nevertheless. Chli b'Shabbos lo, that you can't immerse a vessel on Shabbos. My time, what's the reason? So Amar Rabba says, Rabba, Gzera Shamit Lena Biyada V'Avrenu Arbamos Pushitz Harabim. We're afraid that if we let you take a vessel to the mikvah on Shabbos, that you'll carry it. You'll start bringing your vessels to the mikvah, so it'll lead to carrying. As we pointed out, it's the exact same language that Rabbi uses in the explanation of why you can't take a lulav on Shabbos, and pointed out an interesting question about whether it's clear that he initially said this statement in both cases, or is it possible he said it in one and then the Gemara applied it to the other. But this is the explanation he gives here. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said to him, Yesh lo bor b'chatzero mai. So why should there be a problem if you've got a well, which is essentially a mikvah, in your chutzner, in your yard? And classically, people, would have walls around their courtyards with multiple houses. That's the whole point of a ruvei chatzeros. So why should that be a problem? And presumably that was not such an uncommon thing, because where else would people be getting their water from? So he says, what can you say? All right, it's a gzeira. We don't allow it even if the well is in your yard, is in your courtyard, because it'll lead to cases where the only available well is in the public domain and it'll lead to carrying. So the Gemara says, Hatenach Shabbos. Okay, look, fine. I understand why it should be forbidden on Shabbos. But Yantav carrying is allowed. So why should we allow it on Yantav? So the Gemara says, goes with Yantav atu Shabbos. All right, they forbade Yantav because it'll lead to cases of Shabbos.
Wow.
Now, again, that's a little bit funny because, there's so many things now we should now forbid on Yantav because it'll lead to Shabbos that are things that are fundamentally not concerns about
Yantav.
Yantav.
Ochel Nefesh.
Right, everything related to Ochel Nefesh, have it like reading L'or Haner, a million types of gzeras you get by Shabbos that aren't relevant because those malachas are not problematic on Yantav. One interesting in particular that we do say, this you should be aware of, though, is the Gzeras Merchat Sa'ot, which is the bathing in heated water. That there, the concern is if we let people bathe in heated water, even from before Shabbos, that they will. Rabbanan was not allowed to do it because you'll come to heat up the water. They'll go to these bathhouses, the Roman bathhouses, and they'll go ahead and they'll heat up the water on Shabbos. Now, there's no reason that should really be a problem on Yom Tov, but nevertheless it's forbidden. Now, interestingly, you should say, well, is it really shavu l'chol nefesh, etc.? So there's a whole interesting question about that, about taking a hot shower on Yom Tov. Is it considered something that, it used to be bathing, hot water was only something that everybody needed for their hands and face and feet, not for their whole body, at least, whatever, we'll see that later. But nowadays, a number of poskim say, and I poskim this way as well, that you can take a hot shower on Yom Tov. You have to be careful not to squeeze out your hair. Use liquid soap, not bar soap, but take a hot shower on Yom Tov. But you still can't take a hot bath because of the Gzeras Merchat Sa'ot, even though that's not really so relevant on Yom Tov. So every now and then we do find a Gzera that was started in Shabbos and applied to Yom Tov, although fundamentally there really shouldn't be that problem by Yom Tov. So that's what he's saying here. Yes, it doesn't make sense by Yom Tov, but that's what we do. We forbid Yom Tov as well, not to dunk vessels because it'll lead to carrying on Shabbos. So the Gemara says, Umigas rinon, do we really make such a gzera? V'hatnon, meaning not just make a gzera, but do we really make, the way you framed it, there's a lot of gzeras going on here, right? It starts by one Shabbos case of a bor b'reshut harabim, and then we outlaw a lot of other related things. So there's a lot of gzera. So is that really, are we really that concerned? V'hatnan, we taught in the Mishnah, v'shavim shemashkin esamayim, excuse me, you do hashaka to the water, b'kli even l'ta'aran, avalo matbilin. So you can do hashaka with water to purify the water. You put it in the mikvah and it connects to the water of the mikvah. But you cannot, with a stone vessel, but you can't use an impure vessel and intend to purify the impure vessel in the process. Okay, Isa, if what you're saying is correct, that there's a lot of gzeras going on here, so nigzor hashaka atu hatvala. So how do we allow this thing with the water? We should forbid it because it'll easily lead to the case of dunking the kli itself. So the Gemara says, "V'tispera." Does that make sense that we should make that gzera? Islay ma'im yafim. Honey, lama lahu hashaka. If you have other good water to use, that's tahor, why would you bother doing hashaka with this water? Ella, why go to all this effort? It's just water, spill it out, use your good water. Ella, the lay say, it must be the only reason you're bothering is because you don't have any other water to use. The kivan delay slay, since you don't have any other water to use, mizuzar bahu, you'll be careful not to carry. Now, what does that mean? Okay, so you don't have any other water to use. Why does that mean you won't accidentally carry it? So Rashi basically says, and this is going to be the same thing Rashi is going to say in the next few answers of the Gemara, that what it just means is it's a milsa below shchiach. It means that this is an uncommon scenario, and since it's an uncommon scenario, even if we make gzera ligzeras, we make gzera ligzeras in sort of standard cases. But in even though what might be uncommon is that A will lead to B, but the circumstances of the case themselves, of the initial case, is common. You need to take your thing to the mikvah on Yantiv. That's common. So, or the fact, so the fact that it might lead to a case of from doing it from Yantiv to doing it on Shabbos, that might be not so common, but the initial circumstances is common. As opposed to here, the initial circumstances of needing to do hashaka with your water is very uncommon circumstances, and the principle is milsad lo shchiach will gazer bu rabbanan. They didn't make a gzeira for cases where the initial circumstances of the case were lo shchiach, as opposed to what we're talking about, which is we might be making gzeras, but the initial circumstances are shchiach. Okay, now. The question though is that fine? That explains why. But the Gemara says, why aren't we afraid that when we let you bring it to the mikvah, the water, you'll come to carry the kli? But there's a simpler question, which is, why don't we say that if we let you take the water to the mikvah, you'll come to carry not the kli, but the water, right? So that's what Tosfos says. If you look at Tosfos, he says, "V'nigzar hashaka atu hatbala." So it says the kasha lifroch nigzar mishum shem yaver arbam spushas ram lahashika. Forget the kli. Let's be afraid that you'll come to carry the water. Yeah, you're very like pressured. Aval. So basically what he's saying, until the Gemara introduced presumably the point that you have no other water, whereas if we're assuming that you have other water, so we're not so concerned that you so feel that this is so urgent. But somehow with vessels, maybe you'd only have a much more limited supply of vessels. Not exactly clear what that answer is. Yes.
You said 5 seconds describing what this is. What are you carrying water
without a vessel?
Yeah. Water with a vessel.
Yeah, I don't know. Doing it in your hand. Yeah, I don't know. But so you're right. I mean, what?
You're carrying it in something that's not a kalatuma.
Yes, but you're carrying that other thing as well.
Yeah.
Right. But I don't think he means carrying it with your hands. He means, why is the Gemara saying let's not allow the water because it'll lead to a case of a vessel? The very case of the water itself is a case of carrying if you leave your chutzner because of the water, because of the vessel that the water's in, but not because it'll lead to a different case, which is only about a vessel. Okay, he's just saying, why are we concerned? Why does the Gemara frame it? How do we allow the water? Maybe it'll lead to a case of vessel. It says, how do we allow the water? You'll step out of your chutzner and it'll be carrying. That's what the Gemara should have asked. Okay?
5 seconds.
Yes. Well, all that is again that normally you cannot be metaher food. You only allowed it by water, and presumably the logic somehow being that when you put the water in the mikvah, it's not like you're immersing water. It becomes part of the mikvah. Once it becomes part of the mikvah, and then it's taken out again, it's like it's something completely new. So it's not a process of tahara. That seems to be the logic. Okay, so now the Gemara says like this. Okay, so we have this idea of gzera ligzera. How about the case of the water? Why does that not fall under the gzera? And the answer is lo shchiach. Okay, so the Gemara says, Eisvei, I'll ask you on this. Madlin b'dli tamei v'hu tahor. You can draw water with an impure vessel, and whoops, look at that, the vessel becomes tahor in the process. Okay, now, why is that different than when you do hashaka, you cannot use an impure vessel? So Rashi says, because in this case, basically, you don't start with, in that case, the fundamental thing you're doing is focusing on the water, and that's okay, because it's not tevila, and therefore, the vessel is, but fundamentally, you're doing an act of being metaher something.
Mm-hmm.
You're being metaher the water. So if we let you do it with an impure vessel, that'll be defined as being tovel, a kli. That's why that's a problem. Whereas here, fundamentally, the act you're doing is drawing water, right? That's what fundamentally you're doing. You're not taking something to a mikvah. You're drawing water from the well. So since that's fundamentally what you're doing, even if you use a tummy vessel, it's not clearly an act of tevilas kli, and therefore it's allowed. So the Gemara says, okay, that's all very nice in terms of framing it in a certain way, in a formal way. It's not as much of an act of tevila. But why aren't we concerned it'll lead to carrying if we have so many concerns of carrying? So the Gemara says, if it's true that we make all of these safeguards, gzeras, let's say you can't do the drawing of water because that will lead to an intentional tevila. So the Gemara says no, shani, or just say, or maybe say just using the bucket will come to carrying the bucket. The Gemara says no, shani hasa mitosh shelo hutralo ela yedei delyo zocharu. There, basically, it's the same answer. There, because we're only allowing you to do it through your bucket, basically we're only framing it as a drawing of water, not a tevila. You'll remember, and it won't come to a case of doing tevila. Obviously, they couldn't say to people, don't draw water from your well with a bucket on Shabbos and Yantiv. I mean, you know that they made all these special takanas to make it possible to draw water from the well. The whole pasi biros and so on. So fundamentally, that's a category that's allowed on Shabbos and Yantiv. But the Gemara is saying but if it's tameh and so on, why don't we make a gzeira? And it says no, because fundamentally it's staying within that category of drawing water, and therefore it's not in the gzeira type of a thing. Which means that even with the gzeira, and this is the same as the idea about the hashaka of the water, it doesn't mean, in a way, it's almost like not even against the svara. It's actually very consistent. Gzeira, what allows us to make a safeguard to a safeguard to a safeguard to a safeguard? You said the Mercer is saying, well, then let's answer everything. And then it gives like formalistic answers. This isn't really a tevila, it's more like drawing water. This isn't really a tevila, it's more hashaka. So say, well, that's not a fair answer. That's a formalistic answer. And you're saying we have all of these real concerns. But in a way, it's an answer that makes a lot of sense. Because what legitimates gzeira, and a million concerns built on one another? And the answer primarily is that of gzeira is that it's not that we really are always concerned that A will lead to B will lead to C. It's a formalistic point. If we're going to forbid something, we're going to forbid that case like across the board. We're going to say, don't do tevila. Shabbos, don't do it on Yantiv, not necessarily because we're really concerned that A will lead to B to lead to C, but in a formal way, when we forbid a category, we forbid everything that falls in that category. If that's true, then in the same formalistic way, we can say if it's not defined as tevila, if it's defined as hashaka, or it's not an act of tevila, but it's an act of drawing water, then it's outside of that formalistic boundary. So that's basically what the Gemara is saying. It starts by saying, if you're so concerned in making a million gzeros, forbid this too. It says, yeah, but that's not formally the same act. Yes.
So he draws the water in the bucket from the well.
Yeah.
What's he do with that water?
He takes it home. What do you mean?
Right. In other words, it's not right. So where does the mikveh exactly come in?
It would be if it's a yantiv, it could be anywhere, and if it's Shabbos, it's in the chutzner. But the point is, it's the exact same scenario. You're going to a well with a kli. Right. But the reality is that they never, certainly by Yom Tov it's not a problem, unless you put it under a heading of Tevila, which is Asur. Mm-hmm. And by Shabbos, they actually made it easier for you to draw water on Shabbos because it's such a necessity. Right. So that's the whole point, that this is a category that we allow on Shabbos, but if it's defined as Tevila, we don't allow it. Right. But the Gemara is saying, who cares what it's defined as? Why don't we concern that it'll lead to the other case?
Right, but in other words, he needs the water in the house for whatever reason, right? So otherwise,
it's like turning on your faucet.
Right. Otherwise, he would have taken water from the mikveh and brought it into his house?
No. What do you mean otherwise? He would have used a tahor kli. By using a tameh kli, what you're doing is you're sneaking through the back door and active tevila.
Right. So in other words, they use the mikveh also as a source of cooking water or
The mikveh was their well. You have this in like in Europe. Well, the mikvahs are these basically are these just like deep wells. Is what they basically are. And imagine what the real Mesiras Nefesh was to go down there. I'm saying it was very deep and dangerous and so on. It's interesting to note because sometimes there's a discussion of Mayim Chaim. The Gemara says. The Gemara is never clear. It's actually quite fascinating. The Torah says a Zav needs Mayim Chaim. It never says by a Zava whether she does or does not. And some of the Gaonim said that a Zava also needs Mayim Chaim. The problem is that according to the Gemara Nida, we treat nowadays, all women as a suffix Zava, which would require Mayim Chaim. Now, when you hear Mayim Chaim, I think about it. I think like about a babbling brook or something, some type of a fresh spring. But so how could they have demanded that? But the reality is that a well is Mayim Chaim because you're digging straight down. It's not rainwater that's collected. It's water from underground. And if most of their mikvaot were wells, then it wasn't a big chiddush to say, okay, you need Mayim Chaim. That's what we do anyway. But thankfully, that position got completely rejected by the Rishonim, or else we couldn't do any of our mikvahs nowadays. But anyway, but the reality is yes, the mikvah often would be a well, the same type of a thing you would get water from. Yes.
Getting back to this, then how do we differentiate between taking a bath, taking a shower? If it's all gezerah merchat.
I'm not answering that. I should have brought it in. I knew you'd get to that. We'll get to it when we get back. But the difference is, one is immersion in a body of water. The other is having water spilled on top of you. Yes.
We found a mikveh in Montreal that is Mayim Chaim.
Oh yeah, it's a well.
It's a spring.
It's a spring. Okay. So now the Gemara says like this. Okay, so that's the basic question. Why don't we make these gzeras? And the answer are, no, these cases in a formalistic way are different. It's drawing water with a wet bucket. It's not going to the mikvah. Eisvel asked you, if it got Erev Yontav, we don't let you do it on Yontav because you should have taken care of it from beforehand. So this is a new twist that we haven't seen, which is a nice leniency. If it got Tamei on Yontav, then we allow you because then you're stuck and you didn't have a choice. Well, that's a good point. If it's true that you have all these gzeras, Nigzer de Yontav atu Erev Yontav. So, to make these types of distinctions, you have a chance to do it, not a chance to do it, that shows that we're sort of making the prohibition with very fine distinctions. Your whole approach is we osir it across the board. So if it's across the board, we shouldn't allow it even if it got Tamei on Yontav as well. So the Gemara says, Tuma b'yomtov milsado, shricha milsado lo shricha lo gazru b'rabbanan. Similar to what Rashi said, the earlier answer, the way Rashi explained it. Things getting Tamei on Yontav is an uncommon scenario. Why? Because everybody's already Torah, and everybody wants to be Torah on the Regel, because Aliyah l'Regel and so on, and therefore this is such a rare exception that it did not fall under. It's not because the concern wasn't there, okay, but even sometimes the Gzeros do not apply to rare exceptional cases. Eisvei says, okay, I'll ask you again. If a vessel became tamei with an avatuma, then the vessel's a rishon, then you cannot be matbilit on Yontav. If it came tamei with a vladatuma, which means it touched something that was a rishon, that already was a derivative, then the vessel would be a sheni. Now the reality is that vessels don't become sheni; only foods become sheni. However, as we're going to see, for certain truma purposes, it could be considered a sheni. So therefore, in that type of a case, you can be matbilit on Yontav.
Wait, this became Tamei Yontav?
So that's a good question. So Rashi says is even if it became Tamei on Erev Yontav, it's an additional leniency. If it became Tamei on Yontav, even with an Avatuma, you can do it. If it became Tamei on Erev Yontav, then even there you can do it if it was only with a Vlad Hatuma. Okay, and the basic logic is that it's not considered, it's not considered a real tuma as much. Okay, so it's not so tamei. So it's only tamei from a truma perspective and only rabbinically. So then we would let you do it. So again, it's a very nice leniency here. It doesn't fit into this category of an across-the-board categorical gezerah. So the Gemara says, "V'im isa." If what you're saying is correct, that we make these broad gezerahs, nigzer ha to ha. So let's be concerned that a vladatuma allowing it will lead to an avatum. And again, it's a funny question because you could say nigzor. Then in the case of vladatuma, you'll come to carry it. Right? Who cares that it'll lead to an avatuma case? Let's make a gzer, you'll come to carry it. So Tosfos sort of deals with that. But anyway, let's take a look at the Gemara. So the Gemara says, Vladatuma hechi mishkachas la, no. When do you have a case of vladatuma being a problem? Gabi kohanim. It's only by kohanim, because then the kli that's a sheni will make truma to a shlishi. So the whole thing is a kohanim case. Kohanim's reasoning. Kohanim are careful, so we're not so concerned. They're the ones that are going to want to be put it in the mikvah. They're going to be extra careful. Okay. So now the Gemara says, Tashma, come in here. Damar Rabbi Yechi bar Achi amar Rav, Nida she'ein la begadim, a woman who's a Nida, who doesn't have any clothes that are tahor, she only has the clothes that she's been wearing as a Nida that are tameh, so she can go to the mikvah on Shabbos or Yantiv, as we just learned. But how is she going to get tahor clothes to wear? So what will she do? So Ma'aremes v'toveles bivgadeha. She can go to the mikvah with her clothes on, okay? And if the clothes are loose-fitting enough, it won't be a chatzitza. So the Gemara says, "V'im isa." But if what you're saying is correct, nigzer dilma asilat uli beineu. Let's be concerned that if we're going to make gzeira ligzeiras, that you'll come to, if you allow people to tovel with their clothes on, they'll come to be tovel their clothes when they're not on their body. The Gemara says, no. Shani asa mitoshel hutrala eli yedei malbush zuchurihi. Same answer. That's a very exceptional case. She'll remember because she's only doing it while she's wearing the clothes. That's quite something that she's not going to easily forget and mix up. And therefore, now again, that answer could be the answer that like the answer with the bucket, which is a formalistic difference, which is that is not, a being tovel clothes. That's being tovel yourself with your clothes on. It's a little different than the bucket. The bucket, we wouldn't say is an act of tevil at all. It's completely incidental. The bucket becomes tahor, but it's an act of drawing water. Here it is an act of tevila of her, but it's not an act of tevila of the clothes. It's a tevila that she's doing with her clothes happening to be on, and that won't lead to be, that's categorically different than an act of being tovel the vessel. What did you want to say, though? What?
It's a very non-Talmudic answer. The right way to do it is to let somebody else tovel your clothes, put them in the dryer, then you go to the mikvah.
But you can't do that because you can't be tovel vessels on Shabbos and Yantiv. Right, that's always, not because she'll touch it when she's doing it. Let her be tahor and then let her do it herself. The whole problem is that she doesn't have anything tahor to wear. Now, the other question is that, wait, you can soak your clothes on Shabbos and Yom Tov?
Yeah.
So take a look at Tosfos. I mean, first of all, we'd say you afraid you'd squeeze them out. Before squeezing them out, isn't the soaking itself an act of laundering? So look at Tosfos. Tosfos says, Tema, Hainu Shriya, so you're immersing them in water. V'shriya sur neshu mechabes. We say that immersing something in water is part of the act of laundering it. Now, there's an interesting debate in the Rishonim how much in categorical terms to interpret that every act of getting something wet is really sharia, or is only under certain types of contexts, which are the normal, well, we're going to get to that, which is the normal process of laundering. But Tosfos understand certainly getting something fully immersed in water should be considered an act of laundering. Yesh Lomer, says Tosfos, shari. Since it's getting it dirty in the process, not cleaner, mikvah waters are presumably dirty and there's dirt on your body and so on, that would, even though you're immersing it, it's not considered laundering. Beteda, how do we wipe our hands on a towel? Now, of course, you could say that's only slightly damp. That's not immersing it in water. But you see here that Tosfos understands that even slightly damp is a problem. So here too, although there the whole point is to get the dirt off your hands on the towel, nevertheless here the waters aren't clean. Right, it makes it all dirty. Your body isn't clean, the waters aren't clean, it's not a problem. But you see, by the way, and this becomes an issue, right? Some people just, they spill something on the tablecloth, they say, oh, put on some seltzer. Or they get a stain on their clothes and they put some water on it. So that's vil mechabes. And again, not every Rishon says that just putting water on a local spot is mechabes, but certainly Tosfos feels that way. And this whole distinction here is whether it's derech lichluk or not derech lichluk, derech tinuf. Okay, so yeah, you wanted to say something? Go.
I did. There are so many sugyas that we've already seen about chatzitza.
Yeah.
There's just like a pretty glib, like it's not even treated.
Yeah, no, but there also are other examples about this, about wearing clothes, especially if they're loose-fitting clothes. I mean, we have, if you think about people that more flowing robes and their underwear is really more like breeches, not tight-fitting underwear, and it's all pretty porous anyway. So yeah, I mean, there are Gemaras also though that you could be wearing clothes and it's not a chatzitza. Chatzitza is here closer to the skin.
Right.
So yeah. But yeah, this is assumed that it will not be a chatzitza.
I'll just try to put this in, maybe somewhat unformed, but But Truma for Xeros, I mean, we still differentiate, for instance, between Eretz Yisrael and Bavel. We don't say, let's take Trumos and Bavel because Xera, if you go to Eretz Yisrael, then you won't be taking Trumos and Masos. So what I'm saying, meaning, like, we still draw the line in locations, right? So
One more time, what are you
those are
saying?
separate things. In other words, Gemara's talking about, why don't we go through this? Why don't we go through this because of this, right? We don't apply that.
Well, that's basically the same type of answer as the Gemara is different. That even when you say Gzeira L'Gzeira, which is what I'm saying, Gzeira L'Gzeira, the way the Gemara is sort of saying this, so then we should just answer everything. And the Gemara's answer is no. Even within the context of Gzeira L'Gzeira, we can make formalist distinctions. And what I'm trying to say is that that's not an unfair answer. If anything, it makes complete sense because Gzeira L'Gzeira doesn't always really mean, oh, we're going to forbid every single case because we genuinely believe that A will lead to B will lead to C. What it means is we make something categorically forbidden, but categorically forbidden when it falls into the formal definition. Something that falls outside the formal definition is not part of that category. So that's most of these answers work for that. Like, wearing clothes is different than an active tvila of clothes. Drawing water is different than active tvila of water. It's not so good for the answers of when it gets tamei on yantiv as opposed to before yantiv, or rishon l'tuma as opposed to a vlada tuma. That's not really a categorically different act. That's really just saying, yeah, that's rare, so we're going to let that go. Okay, which doesn't fit so much within the same type of answer. But yes, we do make distinctions. That's exactly what the Gemara is saying. Okay, so that's one whole set of answers which explains what the Gzeira is and somehow maneuvers its way through these different questions. Okay, so the Gemara says like this. Where were we? Rav Yosef, Amar Gzeira Mishum Schita. Okay, which certainly seemed to anyway have been the last case with the clothes. We're afraid that if we let you dunk, if we let you immerse, you'll come to squeeze things out. Now, that's fine if we're concerned about clothes, but a lot of vessels, there's no schita to be done. So the Gemara says, but anyway, at least it applies on Yontiv and not just on Shabbos. So Amalei Abaye, so Abaye said to him, Teinach Kalim Dibnei Schita Ninu. That's good for vessels that can be squeezed, like clothing. But Kalim Dilabnei Schita Ninu Ma'ikal Meimer. How about things that are like, normal, wooden, vessels or whatever, metal vessels. So Amalei, Gzeira Hanu Atu Hanu. All right, this will lead to that. So we made everything forbidden.
What about the women in their clothes? What about
what? Yeah, so that's the ironic thing. But that, so let's take a look. Eisvik Ohani Tiyufta. So once you had to say A will lead to B, you basically are saying Gzeira L'Gzeira. And once you're saying Gzeira L'Gzeira, then the question is, so how do we allow all these exceptions? All the places we just got through asking. V'shani Le'Kiddushaninan, and he gave all the same answers we just gave. Okay, even if we're saying Gzeira L'Gzeira, this case isn't considered an act of tvila in a formalistic way. This case is a lo shchiach case, and we gave all the answers we just gave. Rav Bibi Amar Gzeira Shemi Yishaheh. We're afraid, this is sort of like why you can't do certain things on Chol HaMoed, that if we let you do it on Shabbos and Yontiv, then or particularly on Yontiv, whatever. But anyway, you'll wait till Shabbos or Yontiv when you've got a lot of time on your hands, and therefore it's a zilzal. We want you to take care of it from beforehand. Okay, which is particularly true by Yontiv because because you'll want to be tahor on the Yontiv, and you'll figure you'll leave it all till Yontiv to take care of it. So the Gemara says, now that's better because that works for Shabbos and Yontiv combined, number one. And number two, it helps explain the difference between whether it became tummy from before Shabbos or on Shabbos, or before Yontiv or on Yontiv. Because the whole concern is you should have done it beforehand, and we wanted to ensure that you would do it beforehand. So that answer has fewer Gzeira L'Gzeira problems, more directly addresses some of the issues that we've seen. Okay, so the Gemara says, Tani Kavasi Rav Bibi, we taught like Rav Bibi, Kli Shenit B'Mer Yontiv, Ein Mapilon Osov Yom Tov, Gzeira Shema Yishaheh. The Beitzah explicitly says that the reason it's forbidden if it became tummy beforehand is because we don't want you to intentionally leave it over for Yontiv. So this is a nice explanation. It applies to Shabbos and Yontiv equally. Also explains the difference for whether it became tummy beforehand or during. Rava says, and this answer of Rava becomes the basic answer that all the Rishonim adopt because it addresses most of the concerns from before. Because it looks like you're fixing something, and you're switching it from a status of tamei to tahor. It's also sort of becoming unusable to usable. I mean, not necessarily unusable, but in certain areas it is. So that's like you're fixing it. That's like you're making the vessel.
Like
therefore, it equally applies. Yeah, like a rabbinic type of makeh b'patish. So it equally applies to Shabbos and Yontiv. All of these things about the Gzeira, all the questions about how can you draw the water with the vessel, how can the woman go into the mikvah with her clothes on, those are easier to answer because it's not nira kimitakein. The nira kimitakein has more to do with how, what it looks like, sort of, what the act seems to be about. So in those cases, the act is not about the vessel, the clothes. It's about the woman going to the mikvah. It's not about the bucket.
So
it's
she's
about
attacking
drawing
herself.
the water. Okay, so we're going to get to that. So why is a person basically allowed? Anyway, this answer applies equally to Shabbos and Yom Tov, and it deals with some of the problems, not all the problems. Like according to this, why should it be different whether it became Tameh before Yom Tov or on Yom Tov, before Shabbos or on Shabbos? Okay, but at least this answer deals with a good number of the problems that we raised before. So the Gemara says, why is a person allowed to go to the mikvah, which isn't such an issue from beforehand, because at least in some of the cases, like a concern of carrying doesn't apply, concern of schita doesn't apply unless you start worrying about the hair. Anyway, so here, but according to you, why is a person different? So the Gemara says, no. Adam nira k'maker. If a person's going to the mikvah, it looks like you're just cooling yourself off. It's not as obvious that you're going to fix yourself. What?
Wasn't that a whole problem
Well,
to begin with?
not in cold water. On Shabbos, you can. Now, Ashkenazim don't immerse in cold water on Shabbos, but the Gemara was fine. So the Gemara says, "Hateinich mayim yafim." That's fine if it's clean water. Mayim roim Michael Meimer. If the mikvah water is dirty, obviously you're going just for mikvah purposes, not to cool yourself off. So it should be a problem.
Why? It's not the same thing. Cooling yourself off and cleaning yourself off.
Well, that's what the Gemara is going to say. Sometimes the person is coming in the heat. The rochates afil b'nei mishran, be willing to bathe himself even in like water that was used for soaking flax, even in disgusting water. You just want cold water on you. You don't care if it's dirty. The Gemara says, fine. That's fine if you're going to the mikvah in the summer. If you're going in the winter, what other reason could you have to be going into a dirty mikvah? So Amar Rav Nachman, sometimes you're coming out from the field and you're covered with mud and excrement. And you'll bathe even in cold water, even in dirty water, but it's not as dirty as the stuff that's on you. So you'll be willing to go to the mikvah anyway, just to get the stuff off you, even if it's mikvah water, even if it's not so clean water. So the Gemara says, okay, Tainich b'Shabbos. So I get why you're not going to go to the mikvah on Shabbos and Yom Tov, because it looks like you're just cooling yourself off, or you're just bathing. But how about on Yom Kippur? Yom Kippur, you can't say it looks like you're bathing. You're not allowed to bathe on Yom Kippur. So the Gemara says, Amar Rava, Mika midi b'Shabbos shari b'Yom Kippur and Asa. Is there anything that's permissible on Shabbos, like you're going to the mikvah, that should be forbidden on Yom Kippur? So the answer is, I can think of a couple of things that are permissible on Shabbos and forbidden on Yom Kippur.
Eating.
Drinking, bathing. So Rashi said fine. So Rashi says no, but things that are connected to, malachas, that should be permitted. Do we ever have anything malacha related that's permitted on Shabbos and forbidden on Yom Kippur? No. So Ella Holo b'Shabbos shari b'Yom Kippur nami shari. Since we did not forbid a person going to the mikvah on Shabbos, then because it's not as obvious about fixing and metaking, we allowed it on Yom Kippur as well. Even though on Yom Kippur you are, it's more obvious that you're just doing it for the sake of the mikvah. So the Gemara says, we say the Rava hoil. Does Rava hold of this principle of since it's going to be allowed in this case, we'll have to allow it in another case. The Hatznan, we taught in the Mishnah, if you have a toothache, lo yigma benet achomet, you cannot swallow vinegar so that it should go over your gums and help your toothache. Aval metabelu kedarko, but you can dip your bread in vinegar, which is a more normal thing, and then eat the dipped bread. If you need rapen, if it helps your teeth on the way down, then that's fine. Okay, so but you can't directly drink the vinegar. That's more obvious that it's being done for the sake of refuah, and you can't do refuah on Shabbos. For Amin and Allah, and then we asked on this, lo yigma upalate. Another brighta is don't swallow vinegar and like gargle with it and spit it out, because then it's clearly done with refuah. You can drink vinegar and swallow it. So here it says you can swallow the vinegar for the sake of dealing with your toothache, and the Mishnah says you can't. How do we deal with that contradiction? The Amar Abaye, so Abaye says, when the Mishnah says don't take vinegar on Shabbos, it means don't take it and spit it out. Okay, but yeah, you can take it and swallow it, that's fine. All right, it's not. That's the case of the Mishnah. The Rava says, Afilu tema migameo bolea. Even if we're talking about swallowing, the Mishnah is still forbidding swallowing. So the Mishnah forbids swallowing, the Beitzah allows it. How do you deal with that contradiction? V'lo kasha. Kan kodem tibu, kan la'achar tibu. The question is, what time, when, where in the meal are you? If you're before the dipping part of the meal, by the way, in that context, that whole question, why are we matbil shtei pa'amim, was added after the Gemara, and it was added not just to deal with the fact that we took out the question about the roasted meat, but it was added in the time of the Rishonim, when the normal thing was to not recline during meals. So the very presence of reclining at a meal was seen as bizarre. In the time of the Mishnah was being written, reclining was what you did at any formal meal. Even in context in brachos, where it's not talking about Pesach or whatever, where it talks about going to sit down in a meal, it talks about reclining. So there's no question about reclining at that time. You did the reclining because that's part of what makes this a formal meal, but it wasn't an unusual thing. So anyway, why did I get onto that? Oh, because I'm talking about matbilin. Matbilin led me to the I made a gzera shava matbilin shtei pa'amim to mesubin. Forget that. My head's too much in the seder. Okay. Anyway, so they also would standard do tibul, though, I should say. The question about matbilin shtei pa'amim is the question. The first tibul everybody would do, right, initially. The question is why you do the second tibul during the actual meal, because the tibuls were more for the appetizer course. So the question about matbilin shtei pa'amim was the question about the second tibul you did for the maror during the meal itself. Anyway, they would standard do tibul. So the point is, when are you swallowing this vinegar straight without dunking the bread? If you're swallowing it before the you finished with the dipping service, okay, so you still have all the sauces in front of you. You want to eat a sauce directly. It's not so bizarre. That will allow. But after you're done with all of the dipping and all the sauces, and now you're later in the meal, and you want to go back and have some of the vinegar straight, that's clearly bizarre. That's clearly done for the sake of refuah. So Rava makes the distinction: when are you allowed to do it with swallowing it? Before while you're still in the process of the dipping. After the dipping is behind you, then you can't swallow it. That's clearly the refuah. 1 minute. Let's read the answer. So Rava says, before the dipping, or I guess before and during, you can have the straight vinegar. Once you're done with all the dipping and all the sauces, and you've had your fill of sauces, at that stage to be having the straight vinegar would be a problem. So that's how he deals with the contradiction. So Gemara says, V'im Isa, but if Rabbi just says, if something's going to be mutter on Shabbos, we have to make it mutter on Yom Kippur. So how do you make a distinction before and after the dipping? Like how on the same day can the same act be forbidden before the meal and permissible before the meal and forbidden after the meal, right? I mean, if it's going to be, if you say if it's permissible on Shabbos, it has to be permissible on Yom Kippur. So you should more say if it's permissible for the first part of Shabbos, it's got to be permissible for the second part. The Isa, for Rabbi holds of this idea of Hoyo, Nema, why don't we say Hova Kodem Tibul Shari? If you're going to make it permissible to swallow the vinegar before the dipping, you have to make it permissible after. Is there anything that's permissible for half of Shabbos and forbidden for the other half? So the Gemara says, so how does that work? The Gemara says, you're right. Hadabei Rava Me'ahi. Rava reversed himself from that whole explanation by the swallowing of vinegar before and after.
The whole time.
And in the end, he accepts Abai's explanation, that if you swallow it, it's okay, and the only case of the Mishnah where it's no good is if you spit it out. So the Gemara says, how do you know he reversed himself from the vinegar case? Maybe he reversed himself from his whole position about dunking in the mikvah, and maybe he would have to come to the conclusion that you can't dunk on Yom Kippur because it's obvious that it's not just cooling yourself off and not just bathing. So the Gemara says no. Lo sakadaitach. It doesn't make sense that he reversed himself from his whole approach that dunking looks like bathing and that we're going to allow Yom Kippur as well. Because to reverse himself would mean forbidding Yom Kippur. And the Tanya, and we teach in a Beitzah, that anybody who needs to go to the mikvah, you can go to the mikvah even on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, which is where our question began with, which is going to the mikvah on Yom Kippur. So clearly he has to accept that. And since he accepts that, he's not going to go back down from his answer that if we allow it on Shabbos, we allow it on Yom Kippur. So he has to stick by that answer, and he has to therefore drop his whole answer by the vinegar, because he has to be consistent. He says, once we're allowing it, if we allow on Shabbos, we allow on Yom Kippur. Certainly if we allow for part of Shabbos, we're going to allow for the rest of Shabbos. Yes?
As part of the logic of this entire sugya, is there an assumed gzeira here behind the drinking of the vinegar? Because usually
refuah.
No, but refuah got to do with grinding something to actually make the truma.
Okay,
It's a liquid.
Okay, so two things. First of all, the idea that the issue is gzeira that you'll come to grind is not in the Mishnah; it's in the Bavli. The Yerushalmi does not seem like it holds of that, which is in general true, like things we're talking about right now, I should say. Which is, you notice how all of the answers until Rava were gzeira. Gzeira you'll come to carry, gzeira shani yishaya, gzeira you'll come to squeeze. Those are classic Bavli explanations. The Yerushalmi often does not have things based on gzeira, but things more being. Doesn't mean that it doesn't believe there are gzeiras, but more is focused on things being intrinsically problematic, which is closer to Rava's point. It looks problematic. Putting something in the mikveh is nira kimitakein. So, by the way, I just mentioned that because it's connected, but the whole thing about taking medicine on Shabbos, refuah on Shabbos, it seems like that was just seen as intrinsically problematic. But the Bavli translated it like a type of professional work on Shabbos, maybe also a nira kimitakein. But the Bavli translated it as a gzeira that you'll come to grind spice, to grind the medicine. That being said, it's not true that they only forbade cases which were involved grinding. They did involve anything that is labeled as refuah, certainly something that's involved with taking some type of a liquid or salve or solid or whatever, however that thing was made. The interesting question is, what about doing things like exercise for the sake of refuah? Is that considered refuah, or a massage that you need to massage a muscle or something, right? It's something that doesn't involve any taking of any, liquid or solid, that might be out of the category. But it is true that what's usher for refuah is even taking things that are normal foods if they're done derech refuah.
And that's
Okay?
a malacha-based isser? Or
According to the way the Bavli explains it, it's a concern gzeira shema. Okay,
Right.
that's not necessarily the way the Yerushalmi explains it. I should say that by attributing it to a gzeira shema, it leads to leniencies. For
Right.
example,
Right.
it could be, according to some, there's no issur taking medicine on Yontiv because you're allowed to grind on Yontiv. As we learned before, you can grind spices on Yontiv, right? So there's fundamentally no issur of taking it. Others want to argue that the whole gzeira is more lenient nowadays since we don't grind our own medicine. So the way the Bavli frames it, that's the concern. Yeah.
So basically, Rava's what was his heter for Yom Kippur? Because you don't have the thing of maker, so therefore it's an hanami basically.
Yeah, it's like a low
So,
plug. Once we had to allow it for Shabbos, we're going to allow
But
it
then,
across the board.
but we don't allow a woman to tova on Yom Kippur.
So I was going to get there. So, what's the conclusion of the Gemara? The conclusion is we have multiple explanations for why this is a problem. The first three all have to do with gzeras. It'll lead to something else, which led the Gemara to say, but once you're making gzeras, it's not all logic. Gzera. Once you say gzera, you have to explain the exceptions. And the basic exceptions were explained falling into two categories. One, a type of a lo shchiach, and the other, in a formalistic way, it's outside the category. The final explanation, which is the one that the Rishonim really much more prefer, is Rava, which is it's intrinsically problematic. It's nira kimitakein. That has the benefit of explaining that it's not a gzeira. Explains it's an equal problem on Shabbos and Yontiv, why certain things are not nira kimitakein, like the idea of drawing water with the bucket. It appears in an experiential way it's a different type of an act, or even the difference, for example, about a vlad hatuma as opposed to a rishon hatuma. If it's not so much tamei, it's not so much nira kimitakein. It does not really sufficiently answer the difference between Erev Yontiv and Ad Yontiv, right? That's just, okay, we'll go easy on you. It didn't happen before. We'll make life easy. You didn't have a choice. But that's not so well explained. But other things fit better in terms of this Nir Kimitakein. The one thing that stands out is why is a person a problem? Okay. Isn't that Nir Kimitakein? So it says, no, for a person it looks like a different type of thing. It looks like bathing. Now the last thing that we left with, which is this issue about Yom Kippur, that you're allowed to go, A, a type of a low plug lakula from Shabbos, but B, why are you allowed to go on Yom Kippur? Forget the issue that normally you can't go to the mikvah. Who cares? Why should we allow it? Aren't you bathing on Yom Kippur? Okay. Now the basic point is even on Yom Kippur that we asr everything. It tends to be that we asr all types of bathing when it's derech tainu, not when it's not when it's, for example, like washing to remove dirt from you is not considered the prohibition of washing. So similarly, going to the mikvah for the fundamental purpose of tevilah and not for the fundamental purpose of bathing is not actually a problem on Yom Kippur, but it's a little borderline, and that leads Tosas into the discussion of do you need is what partly allows you to go on Yom Kippur and Tisha B'Av, the principle of Tvila Bismana mitzvah. That if this is the day that you're obligated to go, there's a particular mitzvah that says you should go today, and that overrides whatever types of Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur concerns there are. Again, even though formalistically it's not technically the forbidden type of bathing, it's obviously right there at the end. So Tosa says, well, it's a little different, but okay, because this is not like the same Raisa type of idea, but yes, but somehow it should be done today. So Tosas' answer, he proves from various Gemaras. So first of all, that would have a nafkamina for today, because today women don't, when they go to the mikveh, it's not exactly bismana, because we have the whole thing about 7 clean days and Rabbi Zera. It's not the exact time in the Torah they should be going to the mikveh.
So that's why they don't go.
But Tosa says, if he proves from another sugya that you don't need the principle of tefillah bisman mitzvah. Just going to the mikvah, even if it's not the zman, which is fundamentally an act of becoming tahor and not an act of bathing, is actually okay even without the principle of tefillah bisman. So then he says, so why don't we then go to the mikvah on Tisha B'Av, on Yom Kippur? So if you take a look at his answer, the Shosel Kol Chai B'Tfilos, we'll read a line or two. He says like this. He says, the very last word of the narrow lines of Tosfos, he says, Umiyu, B'Tisha B'Av, Ain Tovlin. Even though in principle you don't need tefillah bismana and if you can go, you don't do it on Tisha B'Av. Rabbi Chananya ben Antignos. Amar Kedayu Beis Eloheinu le'abed tefillah achat b'shana. God, the mourning for the house of God is important enough that we should forego the very first wide line of Tosafos, that we should forego, one tvila of the year. So technically you're allowed, but it's important as a point of making a point of principle that you're not going to do it on that day because of the sense of avelus. Okay, that's Tisha B'Av. Okay, Kamar B'Yushami, Rabbi Levi, Rabbi Chanina ben Antignos. Okay, The Odomeri, I'm now 4 lines down, the wide line. The Bismana ze ain't tovlin lo b'yom kippurim v'lo b'Tisha B'Av. The Dafka heim shayasukim mitaros hayitzarich litvo miyad kedei shelo yitmu hataharot. Why would a person go to the mikvah? Because there's a real need. You don't want to stick around being tamei. There's real consequences to that. So it might not be tefillah bismana, but there's important consequences of not going to the mikvah. The only real consequence of not going to the mikvah is for a woman who's a nida and that she's forbidden to her husband. So guess what? So she can arrange it that she go immediately motza Yom Kippur, but she can't go on the day. Right? But she can't go on the day of Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur because you're not allowed to have sex on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur. So then you were allowed to go because there was be an immediate need and an immediate benefit of just being tahor in general. But now where the whole relevance is to allow sex, there's no thing that would allow it to be done on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur, which raises interesting questions about, let's say, a woman needs to is attending to her husband and so on, like he's sick or whatever, and you need to go to the mikveh not to allow sex, but to allow touch. Would you be allowed to do that on Tisha B'Av and Yom Kippur? Okay, anyway, so that's the end of that circuit. So let's take a look back at the Gemara. So one of the things that is allowed is to do hashaka, but the vessel has to be tahor. It has to be in a stone. If the vessel was not stone, then the vessel would be tamei through the water, and then you would also be being tovel the vessel. And again, that's different than drawing the water with the bucket, because here you're explicitly going to be mitaher, and therefore it can work for the water because that's seen as a different category, but not for the vessel.
The Gemara means by hashaka, not the technical hashaka for a mikvah to be mitaher.
No, but the same idea of connecting the
you're
water.
Dipping the thing in to get the water into the vessel.
Yeah, to get the water in the vessel into the mikvah. You have water in a vessel and you're lowering it into the mikvah, so the waters of the vessel touch the waters of the mikvah. Okay, so the Gemara says, "My avalo matbilin." So what does the end of that phrase? So the Gemara, it says avalo matbilin. The mashikin kli avalo matbilin. What does lo matbilin mean? So I've already described it. Now the Gemara will explain it. Amashmul ein matbilin es a kli al gabe meimav l'taro b'yom tov. So you don't use the excuse of doing hashak on the water to also be tovel the kli that the water is in. So you can't use a tamei kli and be tovel the kli because then it'll be an active tevila of the kli. So the Gemara says, "Mani masnisin." Who's our Mishnah going like? Lo Rabbi, lo Rabbana. Not Rabbi, not Rabbana. Titania, we turn on the Beitzah. Ein matbilin es a kli agabi meimav l'tahara, ve'ein mashikin es a mayim b'kli even l'tahara. Divrei Rabbi. Rabbi says, not only can you not be tovel the kli that the water is in, you can't even do hashak on the water. You can't do either. The Chachamim say, "Matbilin kli yevin agavi meimav l'taro." You can do tefillah on the kli, and certainly umashikin esamayim b'kli yevin l'taron. You can do both the water and the kli. So the rabbis say you can't do either, and the Rebbe says you can't do either, and the rabbis say you can do both.
Mm-hmm.
Nobody is going like our Mishnah, which says you can do the water but not the vessel. Mani, who's our Mishnah going like? Rebbe kasha hashaka. If it's Rebbe who says you can't do either, then the case of the water is problematic because our Mishnah says you can do the water. Rabbanan, if the rabbis who say you can do both, kasha hatbala. So there's a contradiction in the case of the vessel where the rabbis say you can do it, and our Mishnah says you can. So the Gemara says, "Ibai sema Rebbe, Ibai sema Rabbanan." I can make it go like either. This is going to be interesting to see how we do this. Ibai sema Rebbe, Reisha de Beitzah b'Yom Tov, v'Seifa b'Shabbos. The Kula Masnisin b'Yom Tov. So here's how the Gemara is going to read the Beitzah. It's going to read the statements of Rebbe and the Rabbanan that each half of the sentence is talking about a different case. So let's read this Beitzah again, the way the Gemara is going to read it. Okay. So it's ein matbilin as a kli agabe mimav l'taro. You can't be matbil the kli. Okay, that is you can't be matbil the kli. That's the more problematic one, being matbil the kli. That's talking about yontiv. But of course, on yontiv you still could do the water. You just can't be matbil the kli. And the next sentence, the ein mashikin as a mayin b'kli yevin l'taran. You can't even do the water. That's talking about on Shabbos. Okay, so on the first sentence, you can't do the kli, which suggests that the water is okay. That's yontiv. But the second sentence, that you can't do the water, that's Shabbos. So according to that, Rebbe is saying actually on yontiv you can't do the kli, but you can do the water, which is exactly our Mishnah, right? Reisha de Beitzah b'Yom Tov, v'Seifa b'Shabbos, v'Kula Masnisin b'Yom Tov, and our Mishnah that makes the distinction of water and kli is yontiv, and that's how to read Rabbi when he says don't do the vessel, but we're reading it as implicitly the water is okay. That's on yontiv. So on yontiv, Rabbi holds of the difference of water and vessel. Or let's go back now and read how the Chachamim would read that way. The Chachamim omrim matbilin kli agabe meimav l'taro. You can do the vessel. When can you do the vessel? On yontiv. Then you can do both. But umashikin as a mayin b'kli yevin l'taran. But the other statement is no, just the water. Just the water. That's Shabbos. So according to that, the rabbis hold of the same water vessel distinction, except they hold it not just on yontiv. On yontiv they allow both. They hold of the water yontiv distinction on Shabbos. The Beitzah Rabbanan, and therefore it could be the Rabbanan, v'Kula Masnisin b'Shabbos. So our Mishnah that says the water vessel distinction would be Shabbos. Okay, so it's quite a very creative read. The Mishnah seems to make the distinction across the board. For this Rebbe and Rabbanan, we say that actually Rebbe and the Rabbanan both agree to the distinction. The question is, the Rebbe only allows it on yontiv, and the Chachamim make the distinction on Shabbos, and our Mishnah would be going like one or the other. Okay. It's a lot more fun when we were talking about Erev Tavshilin, wasn't it?
Why do you say